Vice President Cheney's contributions to our nation are many and well documented. I have to agree with Rush Limbaugh, who said that perhaps one of his greatest contributions to America was his daughter, Liz Cheney. It's fitting and not at all surprising that Liz Cheney is the founder and co-chairman of the board of Keep America Safe, along with Deborah Burlingame. It's a nonprofit organization dedicated to education and advocacy about American national security policy, and I strongly encourage you, as we heard earlier today, to support Keep America Safe and the American Islamic Forum for Democracy for the great work that they are doing. Liz was the second-ranking State Department official responsible for U.S. policy in the Middle East. Prior to that, she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. If you've seen her on Fox News, you know that Liz provides insightful analysis on U.S. national security policy, and we only wish that the current administration would listen to some of her advice. Ladies and gentlemen, it's with great pride that I present Liz Cheney and the 46th Vice President of the United States, the gentleman from Wyoming, Dick Cheney.
Thank you. Appreciate that. That's it. Go, Dad. Well, we're delighted to be here tonight. I've watched the development of the organization, and Bill and Tony Thompson are close friends. I probably would not have gotten elected to Congress in 1978 if Bill and Tony hadn't helped me carry Cheyenne. I had a very tough primary, but they came through, and you may or may not agree with the outcome, but it was all their fault. But it's been a privilege, obviously, to have the opportunity to spend some time with my daughter. And as I finished up my time in the White House, decided to write a book. And it's nice to have your oldest child interested in listening to all your old war stories and then helping you write them down. And that's what Liz did. And I notice she has the book in her lap tonight. I have no idea what is planned. I'm not sure where this is going, but it's all good. It's all good. But I'm delighted to be here tonight and have the opportunity to spend some time with all of you. And with that, I will introduce my daughter, Liz Cheney, who is seeking political office, but this is not a political event. All right?
I think the NSA is not operating these microphones clearly. Or maybe Barack Obama is. That's a good point. It's wonderful to be here tonight. Wonderful to be here with Steamboat Institute. I think it's long past time that the Aspen Institute got a dose of truth and reality and facts. And we're thrilled to be part of that effort here tonight. We thought we'd do a couple of things. We want to talk a little bit about current events, but the most important current event in our lives, in our family, has been the fact that my dad was blessed, that we all were blessed, because my dad was the recipient of a new heart a little over a year ago. And his story, you know, he talked about his first campaign for office when he was elected. And 1978, when he was running the first time, was also the first time he had a heart attack. And I've been going back for reasons you can imagine, looking at some old news clippings about political campaigns in Wyoming, and came across one where my dad was asked about his heart attack in 1978. After he had the attack and decided he was going to stay in the race, he was interviewed, And the reporter said to him, well, are you concerned that having had this heart attack, it might hurt your ability to get elected? And he said, no. He said, nobody's tried the heart attack shtick before. But he's just finished a book, and I wanted him to talk a little bit about the book, which is about his heart. It's called Heart, and it talks about his 35-year struggle with and challenge and dealing with and really overcoming heart disease. And so I wanted to start tonight, Dad, by asking you just to talk a little bit about that, about, you're the most famous cardiac patient in the country and maybe in the world. And you certainly accomplished great things while you dealt with the challenge of heart disease. And maybe you could just talk a little bit about how you dealt with it. And in particular, what I think is interesting is sort of the mental attitude that you always had about the disease and about not letting it hold you back.
Well, thank you, Liz. Most of you know, obviously, I had a few heart problems along the way in the midst of my career. And after I finally attained a heart transplant 16 months ago, my cardiologist came to me, John Reiner, and he suggested that there was a book that he and I might do together. If you look back at the historical record, between 1968 and 2008, we reduced the incidence of death from heart disease by about 60% in this country. The fact that I'm here tonight at all and that I survived through that period of time, and he described to me at one point as the only heart patient he had still alive who'd had his first heart attack back in the 70s. It wasn't a comment, I don't think, on his care. But we had the experience a couple of years ago. Basically what happened was I'd lived with it and dealt with it in its various forms from 1978 all through my career in Congress, defense, chairman and CEO of Halliburton, vice president, and so forth. And then I went into end-stage heart failure 17 months after I left the White House as vice president. They went in one night, worked on me all one night, and put in a pump to supplement my heart. That bought me 20 months. That got me to the transplant 16 months ago. And it's nothing short of a miracle. But it's also an interesting story, as the way John told it. And I got a phone call one day, this is just before the transplant, from the Cleveland Clinic. And they were going to put on a conference on innovation in cardiology and care of heart disease. And they said, we've got all the suppliers coming, the makers of the devices and so forth. We've got a lot of the docs coming. But they said, we decided we need a patient. And somebody said, well, let's get Cheney. He's had everything done to him you can do to a heart patient, which was true. Up to that point, I hadn't had transplant yet. But this gave us the idea that you can tell the story of that 40-year miracle, really, of what's happened with respect to our ability to deal with heart disease in this country through my story and my case history. And most of the things that saved my life over the last 35, 40 years weren't even around when I had that first heart attack in 1978. The treatment I got then was about like what Dwight Eisenhower got 22, 23 years before in 1955 when he had a heart attack here in Colorado. And so what we do with Jonathan Reiner writing as the physician, I write as the patient, and we tell the story of all those developments, including the historical background of where stents came from and defibrillators came from, and the LVAD, the left ventricular assist device that saved my life, and transplant surgery, the whole body of technology and development of medicine, of cholesterol-lowering drugs, etc. We tell that story through my case. Also then laid against the background of my time in public service. And I was uniquely blessed in many respects. Obviously, you can never express enough gratitude for a donor or the donor's family. You can not talk about what I went through and how I survived it without talking about Liz and her sister Mary and her mother, my wife Lynn. We'll celebrate our 49th wedding anniversary next week. When you go through everything we went through as a family, and the only way to go through it is as a family, if it's at all possible. I wake up every morning with a big smile on my face, thankful for a new day I never expected to see. And so that's basically what the book is about. It's Simon & Schuster bought it. They love it. It'll be out October 8th. It's called Heart, An American Medical Odyssey. And I think it's a pretty good book. It's not political. It's got nothing to do with politics. I suppose you could say that all of my critics who said I never had a heart may want to have that proposition challenged now that I've got proof that I do have. But it's really, it's been a very important part of my life. You don't really talk about it while it's going on. People weren't interested in me as Vice President or Secretary of Defense if I was, quote, had a bad heart. They wanted somebody who could do the job. And because of the great support that I had from my family, from friends all over America who prayed for me, and who were there when I needed support and help, made it possible for me to live a very full and active and otherwise normal life, in spite of the fact that for 35 years I was a cardiac patient, and as the folks at the Cleveland Clinic said, had everything done to him you could do to a heart patient. But so I'm grateful to be here tonight, grateful for all of the support that people have provided over the years, including many of you here in this room tonight, and grateful to be here with my daughter and my first child, and hopefully that remains to be seen. I'll leave it at that and turn it back to Liz.
You're supposed to tell a grandkid story.
Oh, yes. See, she's got the script. She never gives me the script. She just makes certain I follow it. No, but we did, Liz has got 5 of our grandchildren. Kate's the oldest. She's a sophomore down at Colorado College starting this fall. But her youngest is my namesake, Richard. And after I'd had the transplant, the rule is you can't sit in the front seat of the car because they don't want you to get hit with an airbag. A little hard on the plumbing. And so I was sitting in the back seat of the car with my 6-year-old grandson, Richard, and he was asking me, he said, did you get a new heart, Grandpa? And I said, well, yes, I did. And he started asking questions, and so I did the best I could to explain the process and so forth, and how it all came about to my 6-year-old grandson. And he listened very carefully for about 5 or 10 minutes, and then he turned to me and said, yeah, he said, I had one of those when I swallowed the quarter. But my other favorite Richard story, he was in, I guess in kindergarten. Came home from school one day and he told his mom, he said to Liz, he said, Mom, tomorrow I have to stand up in front of the whole class and explain what's special about me. Why am I, Richard, special? And she said, well, what are you going to say? He said, well, I got 2 choices. And she said, what are they? And he said, well, I could say that my grandpa was Vice President of the United States. And she said, yeah, that's a pretty good answer. What's the other one? He said, I could tell him I got my cat at the dump. And and you can guess which one he used.
Okay, so I'm going to tell a Richard story. This wasn't in the script that we would tell 3 Richard stories. So the other thing in our lives, obviously caring for my dad had brought the family together. But we're a family, very much politics has brought us together over the years. And the chance to campaign together as a family when my sister and I were young and we traveled Wyoming with my mom and dad and my grandparents, it really did bring us together and gave us the chance as kids to see how democracy works, to understand how important that process is. And it's a process that I'm now going through again with my own kids. And people have asked me, you know, my goodness, you have 5 kids. How is it that you're able to run for office with 5 kids? And one of the things that I know for sure is that the exposure that I had, the chance that I had as a little girl to see what democracy looks like was an invaluable lesson for me. And a lesson that I'm really honored now to be able to share with my own kids. And so the latest event we all did together was the Wyoming State Fair Parade in Douglas, Wyoming last weekend. And we had my kids and my cousin's kids. So we had a real gaggle of little kids walking in the parade with baskets full of candy. So my campaign manager decided that it would be very important before the parade began for us to brief the kids. Because when you're out there tossing candy, it can get dangerous. So she brought them all together and she said, okay, now we're going to talk about the rules of being in a parade, the rules of throwing candy in parades. And she said, what's, rule number 1? And my older son raised his hand and he said, don't chuck the candy hard. And she said, that's right. That's a very important rule. No throwing that candy hard. What's rule number 2? And one of my cousin's little girls raised her hand and she said, no throwing at people's faces. Don't throw at the faces. And my campaign manager said, that's right. No throwing at faces. She said, now rule number 3 of being in parades and throwing candy. And Richard raised his hand and she called on him and he said, no farting. That's a good life lesson. But it's, in addition to the life lessons that you learn in a campaign, we do want to talk a little bit about current affairs and about what's happening and about the concerns that I know the Steamboat Institute has, and about the concerns that people all across this nation have about the direction of the country. And we're not here to do a political event, but it is very much, those concerns that made me decide to run for office this time around. And I believe that, we are living very clearly at this moment through a critical point in our nation's history. And you can look back at other nations and at our own, at other periods of time, and see when it was that countries came to a fork in a road, when it was that they came to a turning point. You can think about Winston Churchill and his election as Prime Minister in Britain in 1940. The extent to which people around him said, you've got to seek terms with Adolf Hitler, that if you don't seek terms, if you don't surrender, you'll be destroyed. And he refused. He refused to capitulate. He knew the odds were against him, but he saved civilization, and he saved freedom by doing that. You can look at Margaret Thatcher when she was able, in 1979, to save her country from the ravages of socialism, to say, I'm going to turn this nation around, against all odds, against people who said she shouldn't do it, that she should sit down and be quiet. And in our own nation, Ronald Reagan provides that same example of a president who came to office and who saved us from the malaise of the Jimmy Carter era. Now, I think that many times in history, when you look back, you have the ability to see those moments. You don't always know them when you're living through them. We know right now, as we sit here tonight, that we're living through one of those moments. And it is a moment that we've got to make a decision. What are we going to do? Are we going to let this president take this country down a path which very well could lead to its destruction? Or are we going to stand and fight and defend our freedom? And it is a... And I know that you all think of this like I do. When you think of it in terms of the blessing that we have, this nation that we live in, the legacy that we have inherited. The unbelievable miracle of our founding, when for the first time in the history of the world, the founding fathers said, this nation will have its people be the sovereign. It never happened before. And it is an unbelievable blessing that we get to live in a nation where we're free and where men and women have died for our right to be free. But that fact imposes an incredible obligation and duty on every single person in this room, every single American across this country. And that's a duty to defend that freedom. And to defend that freedom against both external enemies, against terrorism, against threats to our national security, but also to defend it against presidents like this radical man in the Oval Office today, who believes that the government is the answer to every problem, does not believe we're an exceptional nation, who thinks that he ought to control at least a sixth of our economy, who said that the private sector is, quote, the enemy. That's what he believes. Now, I think that we have the opportunity today, I think we have the opportunity over the next year, frankly, to be in a position where we send a very strong message to Washington. And that's a message that we're not going along to get along anymore. We're not content with business as usual. We're taking back our freedom. We're taking back our values. And we're going to fight to defend what every one of us knows this country was built on. And before I give the mic back to my dad, don't lose hope. You know, it can be really easy, particularly if you listen to the mainstream media, to think that somehow conservatives are a minority, to think that we're powerless, to think that, you know, gosh, we ought to just be discouraged about 2012 and we ought to give up the fight and sit down and be quiet. If you start to lose hope, think about this. The President of the United States used the IRS, abused the power of his office to go after political opponents. He went after conservatives, he went after Republicans, he went after members of the Tea Party. He had the IRS asking people what they say in their prayers. Now that's un-American, but it also tells you something about our power, because the President of the United States would not bother to use the IRS to go after us if he wasn't afraid of every single one of us. So wherever you live, wherever you have the opportunity to cast a vote, to work for an important cause, to work for an important organization, please dedicate yourselves over the course of the next year to making sure that, you know, 2014 is going to be critical for us. It's going to be critical for taking back the nation. And it's going to be a moment when everybody around the country can hear, especially from those of us in the Rocky Mountain West, that we're not going to stand for it 1 minute longer. Now, one of the questions that I get a lot and that I'm going to ask my dad that I'd like to hear his view on, you know, the media in particular likes to talk about how the Republican Party is in disarray. And we're facing these huge challenges, but we've got disputes going on inside of our own party. And I'd like to hear you talk, Dad, a little bit about sort of your perspective on this as somebody who has obviously participated in politics and policy for a long time and who's seen our party and who's seen the Democratic Party, you know, go through times of change. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on sort of where the party is today and what we've got to do to take back the White House in 2016.
Well, after the 2000, obviously I wasn't happy about the election outcome in 2008, but President Bush and I had our 8 years. We'd worn out our welcome in some quarters, although we're looking better and better every day. But it was easy after, not easy, but it happened to a lot of people, to be down after the 2008 election, and we lost, but then we went through. I can remember in that morning on January 20th of 2009 when we swore in the new president. There's a certain ritual that goes with that I've always been fascinated by, and there have been 5 Republican presidents since Eisenhower. I worked for 4 of them and worked very closely with the 5th as part of the congressional leadership. And So I've always been intrigued by that transfer of power, new administration coming in. I can remember when President Ford lost in 1976. One of my jobs, I was in as chief of staff, was to read his concession statement over the telephone to Jimmy Carter, because President Ford had lost his voice. He'd been campaigning, working so hard in those closing weeks of the campaign, he'd be literally, his voice was gone. All he could do was just a bare whisper. And he called me into the Oval Office. We sat down and drafted a telegram. And then he told me to get Governor Carter on the phone, which I did. And he introduced me, and then I had to read that statement. That was a real bummer. That was about as low as you could get when I think about my political career. But as I look back over it now and think about those particular days, but a lot of my experience is that out of adversity rises opportunity. And that what I think back to that period when we lost the '76 election, it was on the heels of Watergate. Nixon had been forced to resign. And so there are a lot of things you could be pretty grim about. But with the perspective of a little time in history, we had to go through that Jimmy Carter period to get to Ronald Reagan. And that morning when I read that telegram, that was for me the beginning of what became the Reagan Revolution, when we were all Reaganites by 1980, when we got behind Governor Reagan and I think did some tremendous work. Took back the Senate that day and put a man in the White House who believed in all of those things we all believe in the creed, if you will, of your institute. And I tend now, when I look at what's going on out there, and there's an awful lot that I do not like about what's going on. I'll say a word or two about it in a minute. But I look forward to the next election and all the elections coming up as it's not going to be easy. Nobody's going to hand it to us. We're going to have to go out and earn it one vote at a time. We're going to have to raise the money and recruit the candidates and build the organization and put forth the program that the American people will believe in and will support. And it's our right as Americans to go do that, and it's our right as Americans to go change the government. And that's, by golly, what we're going to do.
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot of concern. I hear a lot of discussion, and the political debate these days has focused an awful lot on domestic affairs for good and legitimate reasons. But I am perhaps even more concerned, or at least as concerned, about what's going on internationally as I am about what Barack Obama and his administration are doing domestically. And why do I say that? Well, one of the most memorable days of my life, obviously, was 9/11, when after the planes struck the World Trade Center in New York, I was in my West Wing office working my speechwriter, and some of the staff gathered around when word came down that there'd been an attack in New York. And then shortly after that, the door to my office burst open. One of my Secret Service agents came in. I was sitting down in the chair, and he said, "Sir, we're leaving now." He didn't ask. He didn't say, "Would you come with me?" He said, "We're leaving now." And he grabbed the back of my belt with one hand, put his other hand on my shoulder, and propelled me literally out the door and down the stairs, headed for the emergency operations bunker underneath the White House. And we got partway down there, got into a tunnel, and he told me the reason they'd evacuated me was because there was a hijacked aircraft that had been reported by Dulles headed towards Crown. That's a code word for the White House, at a very high rate of speed. Turned out that was American Flight 77 that went into the Pentagon. But what emerged out of that whole day, obviously, was not a terrorist act. It wasn't a law enforcement problem. It wasn't a matter of us sending out the FBI to go find the bad guy, bring him to trial, and lock him up. It was an act of war. It was worse than Pearl Harbor. Killed more Americans than Pearl Harbor did. Took place in the heart of New York City and Washington, D.C., blew a hole in the Pentagon. And if it hadn't been for those very brave passengers on United 93, they'd have taken out the White House or the Capitol building. That's about as bad as it gets. we had one of the key decisions we made in the Bush administration, and we made it basically that night and the next morning after the day was over with and the president was back and addressed the country. Lynn and I were evacuated off the south lawn of the White House in one of the white-top helicopters up to Camp David. That was a secure, undisclosed location, but we wanted to make sure the president and I weren't in the same location because we wanted to preserve the continuity of government. One of the things we worried about throughout that period was that we were very careful not to get into a situation where an attack could take us both out. And but I had the opportunity to sit up there that night, most of the night, and watch the reruns on television of what had happened that day. As I think people did all over the country. I'm sure many of you did too. But we began to think about, okay, what do we have to do now? How do we make certain that never happens again? And then we go get the guys that did it to us. And the key decision was to say that was an act of war, because then we were justified in marshaling all of our resources, including our military manpower, our intelligence capabilities, and using all the powers of the president under Article 2 of the Constitution as the commander-in-chief. And that's what we did. And during the course of that, we put in place a terrorist surveillance program. It's now referred to as the NSA program. Basically, though, what it did was it allowed us, and I'm confident the program we put in place, obviously I haven't been involved in the classified stuff since I left the White House, but the program we put in place saved, as General Alexander has said, the head of NSA, stopped over 50 attacks on the United States and our friends overseas over the course of the last 10 or 12 years. We put in place the enhanced interrogation program, waterboarding. Some people said that was torture. I don't believe it was torture. KSM may have felt like it was torture. But the fact was that the enhanced interrogation program, signed off on by the Justice Department, using techniques we used on our own people in training, it wasn't torture no matter what anybody said. It was a good, legitimate program that let us develop the intelligence we had to have to keep America safe for 7.5 years. And it worked. You know, the record speaks for itself. The CIA put out a classified report in '04. We captured KSM in the spring of '03 in Karachi. And then he ultimately was subjected to enhanced interrogation. And a report was published, classified by the CIA. It's subsequently, I asked, and it has been declassified, although it's still got parts of it redacted. But the headline on it is Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, preeminent source on Al-Qaeda. That's the place where we learned most of the intelligence we had, at least back in the mid part of our time there, about what Al-Qaeda was all about where they were based, how they were funded, what their plans were for the future, where their training camps were located. On 9/11, we didn't know any of that stuff. We knew Osama bin Laden was in Pakistan, but that was about the extent of our knowledge. And the way we kept the country safe was to go get that intelligence. And again, according to the agency itself, the way we did that was by subjecting him, because he was subjected more than anybody else to enhanced interrogation techniques. And why do I tell you all that history? This administration doesn't get it. They just don't. And Obama made a speech here not too long ago. It was at National Defense University, maybe about 3 months ago in May, and basically said, okay, now we're returning back to the pre-9/11 days, i.e., we're not at war anymore. We're going back to pre-9/11 when it's just a law enforcement problem, and we'll go try to round up the bad guy when they blow something up. And we're no longer on a war footing, if you will, in terms of thinking about the state we're in. I think that's dead wrong. I think it's an absolute total misreading of where we find ourselves today. As I look at that part of the world, now North Africa, a good part of the Middle East, not just Afghanistan, where they launched 9/11 from, but also Yemen, and of course a major struggle underway in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood having taken power there. The Muslim Brotherhood, by the way, spawned all these other radical Islamic groups, Egyptian Islamic Jihad, Al-Qaeda, Muslim Brothers founded back in the 1920s, and out of that has come most of the major Islamist terrorist organizations. But they are out there. All you've got to do, if you have any question about it, look at Benghazi in Libya, and all across the Middle East, and clearly in other areas such as Pakistan, Iran, we see obviously significant elements of radical Islamist belief and action and activity. They have a much larger geographic base from which to operate now that they can use as sanctuary and safe harbor than they ever had on 9/11. We've got a major problem with respect to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Nobody likes to hear that. That's a dirty word after we went into Iraq because of our concern about weapons of mass destruction. But it was a legitimate concern. Saddam Hussein had twice had nuclear programs underway. 81, the Israelis stopped it when they took out the Osiris reactor. 91, we took it out during Desert Storm. But he preserved the technology and the capability of the people to get started up all over again. When we took down Saddam, we shut down the Iraqi nuclear threat. When we shut down the Iraqi nuclear threat, Muammar Gaddafi saw what we did to Saddam, and he called up and surrendered all of his stuff. He had centrifuges, he had uranium feedstock, he had a weapons design, a Chinese nuclear weapons design. All of that stuff now resides here in the United States because Gaddafi didn't want to have happen to him what happened to Saddam Hussein. In the end, he got even worse and deserved it. When we got Gaddafi, we went after a guy named A.Q. Khan. Khan was the father of the Pakistani program. And he also then went into the black market operation himself and was selling nuclear weapons technology to the Libyans. They were his best customer, to the Iraqis, to the North Koreans. And we shut down A.Q. Khan's black market operation. So we took out three major sources of proliferation. That in and of itself was reason enough for us to go do what we did to Saddam Hussein in Iraq. But the threat hasn't gone away. You may remember it was discovered in the spring of '07. This is a few months after North Korea set off their first nuclear test, that the North Koreans had built a nuclear reactor capable of producing plutonium in the eastern Syrian desert. Now, Syria's a mess today. Everybody's worried about chemical weapons. Imagine what would have happened if the Israelis hadn't taken out that nuclear reactor in '07. Thank goodness they did. I wanted to do it ourselves. I lost the argument, but fortunately the Israelis went ahead and did it for us. We also found from A.Q. Khan that the North Koreans bribed senior Pakistani officials to acquire the latest state-of-the-art technology for enriching uranium. And we know from an American scientist who's been to North Korea and seen it, that the North Koreans now have 2,000 centrifuges, state-of-the-art technology operating to produce enhanced uranium. Their nuclear program, the infrastructure is better now than it's ever been. And they've already proven to be first-class proliferators. This administration, in the midst of all that's going on, first of all claims there is no problem. Terrorism problems over Al-Qaeda's through. We got bin Laden. There's no terrorist threat in Benghazi. And that obviously turned out to be just frankly a blatant lie. And they're still covering it up. You look at their recognition of the threat out there, it's basically non-existent. In the midst of the week that Obama went to Israel and met with Netanyahu, and they talked about the uranium, the nuclear threat from Iran, shortly thereafter they announced that we were cutting our naval aircraft carrier battle groups in the Persian Gulf from 2 down to 1, cut our naval forces there in half. Bold talk against the Iranians, threats, don't cross that red line, and at the same time pulled a carrier out. The Truman was scheduled to deploy to replace it, and it's still locked up, tied up at the dock in Norfolk. They are cutting the defense budget by huge amounts. One of the great things we had with Ronald Reagan was a man who understood what was needed in terms of our national security capability, build it. First call I made after Desert Storm was over with when I was defense secretary was to Ronald Reagan in California and thanked him. And what I said frankly, was I said, Mr. President, I want to thank you for all those $600 toilet seats you bought. He said, Dick, darn it, he said they didn't cost $600, and of course, and then he got the joke. But our capacity to win in Desert Storm was in no small part because of the decisions he'd made 10 years before about our military capabilities. Think for a minute now, you've got massive cuts underway, sequester of the budget. We're having trouble keeping pilots in the Air Force because they don't get to fly anymore. Oftentimes, squadrons have just been grounded. Our ground rule was a pilot had to get 30 hours a month to maintain his proficiency. We've got a lot of them now who aren't, so they're leaving. What we are doing by the actions of the administration, in some cases the inaction, is we are crippling the capabilities that a future president will have 10, 15, 20 years from now to deal with that next crisis. Because that's how long it takes to build quality military forces. It's not like letting a highway contract and tomorrow somebody's pouring concrete. It takes years to get a really first-rate, top-notch NCO in the Marine Corps, any of the other services, to develop the technologies we need to build the tanks and provide for the training and the proficiency that our troops demonstrated so tremendously in Desert Storm. That capability is not going to be there after Barack Obama gets through his 8 years in the White House. And one of our major priorities has to be to recognize the threat still exists. It doesn't matter what he says. They're still covering up Benghazi. They still don't want to admit that there's a major threat out there, and he could care less about the quality and the state of our military capabilities. So I think not only are there a lot of very good reasons to be concerned about where he wants to take the country domestically with Obamacare and so forth, and abuses like the IRS, but I am deeply, deeply worried about what kind of national security posture we will have, how good our word will be around the world, our capacity to deal with threats. I mean, if you can't even mount a rescue operation from Sigonella, an hour away from Benghazi, when 4 of our people are being killed by Al-Qaeda terrorists in Libya, what's that say for the next time you got a big problem to deal with? And hundreds of thousands of lives at stake. I still think the biggest threat we face is the threat of terrorists armed with something deadlier than airline tickets and box cutters. And we have to be able to defeat that threat. So I'm sure I've gone on longer than I was supposed to.
No, but I have a question. I want to go back to the NSA program. And you said something important, which is that you could vouch for the program that was underway when you were in office. But obviously not being read into the program now, it's a different situation. And I think everybody in this room would agree Barack Obama is no Dick Cheney. And when you have a president who has shown himself to have such a complete disregard for the rule of law, who's shown himself willing to use the IRS to go after political enemies, who's shown himself willing to completely disregard the Constitution to decide, well, I'm not going to implement the employer mandate because it's inconvenient for me, even though it's the law, who's shown himself, frankly, completely irresponsible when it comes to protecting Americans' privacy. You have an awful lot of Americans out there now, and in light of a lot of news stories we're seeing that say, well, you know, the NSA made a mistake and they listened to phone calls from Washington, D.C. because it has a 202 area code, which is similar to the country code for Egypt, was one of the latest reports. So there's a lot of concern out there. And when you think about sort of the threat that still exists and the fact that we've got to be able to defend ourselves both from the threat that the president's posing to our freedoms domestically, also from terrorists internationally, what do you do in a situation where you have a commander-in-chief who has put a very important program at risk, in my view, who may well be undertaking a real abuse of power? If he's willing to do it in areas we can see, what makes you confident that he's not doing it in areas that we don't see?
Well, the first thing you do is you get yourself a new commander-in-chief.
I have some ideas about that.
Yeah. No question, this is a difficult subject matter, and I know there are a lot of Americans out of there, some of them good friends of mine, who are concerned about the NSA. Part of the difficulty is, and I plead with people, don't conflate the NSA with the IRS. Those are totally different problems, totally different issues. I believe there's ample evidence that the IRS has indeed abused its power, that the power and authority of the IRS has been used and misused to go after the opponents of the administration. No question in my mind. And it's, in my mind, it ought to be, we ought to investigate it, subpoena whoever we have to subpoena, bring them to trial, and make certain that we build in the kind of safeguards that can be used again. But it would be a terrible mistake if, because the IRS has been abused by Barack Obama and his people, we would therefore turn and say, well, we're going to get rid of the NSA program because it might be abused by this president. But there aren't any really good examples out there of how the NSA program has been abused. You don't have the kind of evidence there that you've got with respect to the IRS, where you've got people, who have been interrogated by the IRS about their political beliefs. And Keith Alexander, who is the commander of the National Security Agency, 4-star now, he's one of the finest officers I've ever known, as was also true for people like, now I've forgotten his name, later became Mike.
Alan?
Well, Alan before him. I'm thinking of Mike McConnell.
Hayden.
Mike Hayden and Mike McConnell. Mike McConnell was Navy captain on my watch when I was Secretary of Defense, the J2 on the Joint Staff. I eventually got him promoted to 3 stars, and he ran the National Security Agency on my watch when I was at Defense. Mike Hayden, who was in charge before Alexander, and then went on over to run the CI. Those are 3 gentlemen, all of whom commanded the National Security Agency at one time or another on my watch. I served on the Intelligence Committee. I worked with them. They all worked for me when I was Secretary of Defense, because the Secretary of Defense controls a bigger part of the intelligence community than does the CIA director, and while I was Vice President. These are some of the finest men I know. And I know how hard they worked to put together a good program, and a program that would allow us to collect intelligence, while at the same time we safeguarded the civil liberties of the American people. I'm the one that took the request into the president after I'd met with the CIA director and the director of the NSA shortly after 9/11, and said that the experts tell me we can do more, we can learn a lot more, we can understand better the threat if we can get additional authority. And that is, in fact, then what the president did, but with a caveat that he personally had to review it every 30 days and reauthorize it, or it wasn't going forward. It was going to stop. In terms of the Congress knowing about it, well, I used to brief the committees, the chairman and ranking member of the committees, on the status of the program for several years in my West Wing office. We once had a meeting in the Situation Room that included the Speaker of the House, Majority Minority Leader of the House, Majority Minority Leader of the Senate, and the Chairman and Ranking Member of the Intelligence Committee of both houses. So it was that 9 people. Nancy Pelosi was in the group. And had them sit down. The question was, do we need to go back to Congress and get more authorization for this program? And this was back in '04. And I had them briefed, had General Hayden there that day to brief on the status of the program, showed what we were learning, what we'd accomplished, and so forth. And I went around the room and said, does anybody here believe we should terminate the program? Absolutely not. Unanimous. Everybody keep doing it. It's the right thing. So then I went around the table and I said, do you think we should come back to the Congress and get more legislative authorization for this program that we've put together here? And they were unanimous. Absolutely not. If you bring it back to the Congress, it'll leak, and you'll tell the bad guys how it is we're reading their mail. But that was the situation when we were there. Now, I know Keith Alexander is now there in command of the NSA. I have not been involved in classified meetings since I left some 4 years ago, but I am confident with men like General Alexander involved, and given the professionals in the intelligence community, I've never seen a situation where they violated for political purposes, the way has happened with the IRS, the authority they have. And I don't know how Obama deals with all of that, obviously. I know how we dealt with it, and we were absolutely scrupulous in making certain that that power and authority was never abused. Now, every once in a while, in a big organization, I'm sure there are problems that crop up, but there are safeguards built into it. We got the FISA courts, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act courts, that have sign-off on these programs. And before you can dig into any of those records, in terms of reading content, for example, you have to have the authorization from FISA. So I know everybody's concerned about it. I understand the concerns. But the last thing I would want to recommend is, well, Obama might abuse the NSA authority, and therefore we ought to shut it down. Last possible thing we ought to do. These are good folks doing the best they can to safeguard the nation. I'd let Keith Alexander cover my back anytime.
Well, we can move on off of this, but I think, again, if you look back and you talk about abuse, you guys were also scrupulously careful not to have the head of the IRS at the White House. He may have been there once. We know the President of the United States had him in something like, 72 times. And I think there's a real question about, in a democracy, under threat, you have programs that you put in place to defend the nation. But then you end up with a commander-in-chief who seems not to care about defending the nation, the Constitution, the rule of law, Americans' privacy, and it gives rise to concerns. And I think you've got to talk about, there's got to be a place between saying you're going to trust him implicitly because we trusted you guys when you had the program, and we're going to throw the program out. And I guess that would be my final question on this. Don't you think there's a legitimate question American people ought to be asking? And you can say, well, the program's classified, so you can't talk about it. But when you begin to see the kinds of things we're seeing about the program, those of us who know we've got to defend against attacks from the outside, at the end of the day, that comes directly into Barack Obama's lap. And it seems to me you've got to say this is a president who's put us at risk because of his unwillingness to exercise the kind of care and concern for the Constitution, frankly, that you guys did.
So what's your solution?
A new commander-in-chief.
Yes, yeah, exactly. All right. No, I understand the concern everybody has. And, I'm as much of a small government guy as you're going to find. But I believe very strongly in a strong national defense. I served over 4 years on the House Intelligence Committee. I've been heavily involved in the intelligence business a good part of my career. And I know how dangerous a world we live in, how difficult it is oftentimes to collect the intelligence we need to make sure we get it right. And it's not a perfect business. It just isn't. It's very hard. What you're after are the secrets that are being kept by the worst regimes, and the ones they more than anything else want to protect. And sometimes the intelligence community makes mistakes. But as a general proposition, I would argue that for the most part, what we've done with our intelligence community, especially since the 9/11 period, has been by the book, well managed, not perfect, hell no, nobody's perfect, but that they do have in place procedures to make corrections when they have to. And the last thing I want to do is be in a position where we say now that we need to shut it down, or we need to significantly limit their capacity and their capability, so we'll be confident they're not abusing their authority. And we'll only reduce their capabilities by 10 or 15%. Now, which 10 or 15% of the next attack is it you're willing to accept? You know, we get into the situation. There was a book written about me at one point called The 1% Solution, because I once made the statement that our defenses against terrorism and against attack with deadlier weapons than 9/11 have to be 100% successful. And most businesses, most line of works, you know, if you get a success rate of 80 or 90%, heck, that's pretty good. When you're defending against a potential attack against one of our major cities by a terrorist armed with a nuclear weapon, you willing to accept 99%? I'm not. I think you have to do everything you can to stop whatever might conceivably be coming at you, and that means you've got to be aggressive with the military. That means you've got to go overseas sometimes and be actively engaged and making certain the people with the technology don't provide it to the people with the motive to come use it against us. It means we have to work doubly hard here at home to make certain that we can indeed defend against that next attack. And as I'm saying, based on my own experience, both with respect to the threat, with respect to our success after 9/11 and what we were able to do primarily through the intelligence community as well as our military forces to prevent that next attack, I think NSA is a well-run program. It's an important program. It's important to the security of the nation. Now, we've got a president that concerns us for a lot of reasons, but I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I would not say just because we've got a president who we don't think is up to the job or doesn't have the same concerns and cares about the Constitution that we all do, that we therefore ought to minimize the capabilities of our defense capability, our defense forces, and our intelligence forces to protect the nation. I just think we got it the wrong way around. We got to go beat him at the next election. We got to get him out of office, and we've got to elect people that we can trust and have confidence in. It's a tough problem. I don't deny it. I despise what they've done with the IRS, what happened at Benghazi, but we should not. I mean, there are, I know so many of our intelligence professionals out there all over their world. They put their lives on the line day after day after day for all of us. And we were successful at stopping all further attacks against the United States during those 7.5 years. And boy, I'd back them to the hilt and do everything I can to support them because they deserve it.
Well, I'm glad to see you haven't gone squishy in your old age.
Okay.
I think we're going to take a couple questions from the audience. But before we do that, I just wanted to end by talking about our men and women in uniform. And when my dad's memoirs came out, he and I spent a lot of time together around the country talking about his life and talking about his career. And when I would ask you the question of what was your the job that you sort of treasured most or valued most, I know Secretary of Defense was normally the answer. And the time you got to spend with our men and women in uniform. And I know that one of the reasons so many people are concerned about the budget cuts and about particularly what's happening at the Defense Department is because of what it's doing to the military. And you mentioned earlier what it's doing to our readiness, the fact that we're hollowing out the force, but also what it's doing to our veterans. And what we owe to those men and women who put their lives on the line and then who come home. And the extent to which the kind of budget cuts we're seeing may well mean that we're not taking care of them the way that we should be and living up to the promise that we made to them. And there's a story you tell in the book, and it's actually a prayer that I wanted to see if you would sort of end our section with tonight. Maybe tell the story of where this prayer comes from, and then read this section of the prayer to people.
Well, towards the end of my time as vice president, Lynn and Liz and I were invited to a special occasion. I spent a lot of time both when I was at Defense as well as when I was vice president with our guys in Special Operations Forces. And a group of them have developed over time. They frequently have a social get-together. And it's all done, it's not classified, but it's not done out in public. There's no press present, obviously. And they get together and honor one another. And families are included, spouses are included. And Liz and Lynn and I were invited to attend one of these sessions. It was a very, very special night for us. And at the dinner that night, where you had a lot of guys who had devoted several years to the efforts in Afghanistan and Iraq. Many of them wounded, an awful lot of Purple Hearts there that night. They had a young chaplain was asked to deliver the invocation. He happened to be from Wyoming, and this is the heart of what he said. We are soldiers, God, agents of correction. May our world see the power of faith. May our nation know the strength of selfless service. And may our enemies continue to taste the inescapable force of freedom. That says it all.
Now, I think there are questions somewhere.
The question is, or is it, I think it was directed to you, Liz.
Well, you go first. If I don't like your answer, then I'll chime in.
The question is, who would I pick as the next commander-in-chief? Well, I haven't signed on with anybody yet at this stage. I do, I have been impressed that I think we are should undergo a generational change in terms of leadership. I don't think we're likely to see somebody who's been engaged in the past sort of regenerate a new successful campaign. There just comes a time when your moment has passed. Certainly mine has. I'm 72 years old. I had a great 40 years in the business. But I want to see somebody else come along and take over. And I think there's some promising folks out there. And obviously I have favorites in that generation. But I look at, pardon? Oh, no. I thought Liz said that for a minute. I think of people, and a lot of you know them or seen them operate. People like, I like Kevin McCarthy from Bakersfield, California. Now, how many of you know Kevin? He's the House Whip now. He's a very talented guy. He's got my old job. I was once the House Whip. Not that well known nationally at this point, but in terms of making the trains run on time, he's got a key job in the House. I look at Marco Rubio from Florida, Paul Ryan from Pennsylvania. These are people I've gotten to know well. So I think there are, I'm trying to remember the name of the governor of New Mexico.
Susana Martinez.
Susana Martinez. I loved her speech at the convention when she said she was 18 years old and her daddy owned a security firm, and he gave her a Colt 45 and put her out front of the bingo parlor to guard the bingo game. That had a certain appeal. But no, I think we've got folks coming along in that next generation. I think we got a lot of governors out there. that have got a lot to offer. They've been out there actually doing it, making those tough decisions, balancing budgets, cutting taxes. So I'm not at all pessimistic. It'll be a tough process. We've got hard-fought primary process, I must say. I'm inclined to think what Priebus is trying to do by way of moving up the convention is a good thing to do. We ought to have tough, hard-fought primaries. That's important. But I don't think we need 23 debates, or however many it was. We end up beating up on each other to the point where all we've done is create all the lines for the Democrats to use against us. Good, tough primaries, fine. I believe in them. But we need to have an orderly process, and that we also need, I think, to do a better job than we ever have before on the party mechanism. One of the things that the Obama crowd did better than we have was the machine they built to identify and get their votes out. And they never shut it down. You know, they built it and used it in '08, and they kept it going. A lot of people payroll full time until 2012, and it's still cranking away out there right now tonight as we meet. And we need to be able to take advantage of all the modern technology to be able to identify our vote and get them to the polls, and to be better organized than the Democrats are. So there are a lot of things like that that I think will enhance our chances. In terms of picking the next president, I'm not ready to do that yet. I want to see a lot more out of the potential contenders, but I think we'll see a lot of people come to the forefront, and that's basically healthy for our party, as long as, you know, we end it soon enough so that it doesn't become a death march for whoever we do finally nominate.
I just want to add two things. I agree with what you said about sort of the next generation at the commander-in-chief level. And I think people should think about that when they're thinking about Hillary, because she's the last generation. She's not the next generation.
And she blew Benghazi.
And as the esteemed former vice president pointed out, she blew Benghazi. And she lied to the American people about it. And secondly, I just want to put a plug in for Adam Putnam, who is the Commissioner of Agriculture in Florida. He used to be the House Policy Chairman, the Republican Policy Chairman, went back to Florida. I hope Adam will run for governor. He's another young up-and-comer in our party and somebody really to watch. But I think we clearly have the ability, given where we sit today, and given the challenges we face, to defeat Barack Obama in 2016, and we have the obligation to do so for the sake of the nation.
Mr. Vice President, in case you think that you might not be pessimistic, this particular question might change your mind. Actually, I could make it for both of you. It's kind of a composite of several of the questions that were sent up. Despite how we got here, the places that we are in the Middle East right now, with Egypt, with Syria, with Iran, seems about as intractable as anything any of us have ever seen. And taking on the political side, does it concern you with some people that lean toward the libertarian isolationist side of the party, that questions of what to do with countries like this might be just shoved off and end up being horrendous in the future?
Yeah. Well, those are key questions. I think partly it's important for us to distinguish between the situation in different countries. There are obviously common themes and similarities that run through them. I look at what's going on in Egypt today, and frankly, I've been supportive of the military. Why do I say that? Well, I think they have my experience with the Egyptian military, and it's extensive, going back to 1990, when it was time to begin to get organized to deal with Saddam Hussein's aggression in Kuwait. Been a pretty professional force, and I think they got involved in toppling the Morsi regime because there had been an upwelling of support for that proposition from the Egyptian people. There, in fact, were petitions circulated that could be signed only by Egyptian voters. That Egyptians had held the card that made it possible for them to vote. And they got far more, the petitions called for the removal of Morsi, and they got far more signatures than all the ballots cast in the previous election. I think the Egyptian military responded to that. I think there's a majority view among the Egyptian people that they do not want Egypt to become an Islamist state like Iran. And I think the military generally is supported by the vast majority of the Egyptian people. And I think we ought to preserve our relationships with that Egyptian military. I think it's a lot like Ataturk in Turkey back in the 1920s, brought Turkey into the modern era. And so I don't automatically look at it and say this was a coup, that's bad. My own personal view is that the military has responded to the legitimate concerns of the majority of the Egyptian people, and that what ultimately will arise from that would be free elections and another shot at democracy, but not one that's dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood. In terms of the overall situation with respect to Syria, Syria is a huge mess. And you can talk now about, it's almost as though whoever wins, we're going to have problems. If there ever was a time to try to intervene to shape that situation, it was some years past. And right now, today, they're in terrible straits, but they're also in a situation where you have to be very concerned about who's going to inherit the chemical weapons they obviously possess. As I said earlier, thank goodness they don't have a nuke. But it's indeed a very worrisome situation. There was a second part to your question.
Well, Iran, of course,
Yeah.
is the other one, and then the political side of it.
Political.
What happens, I'll just speak up.
Here?
This doesn't work. What happens politically if some of the people involved who have a very strong tendency toward isolationism.
Yes, okay, I got you.
People take care of themselves.
Yeah. I understand the temptation to say to heck with them, it's their problem, let them go solve it. Why should we mess in it? We decided back in 1941 that didn't work as a basic policy. We had, there were a lot of people who believed in the 30s the United States should not get involved overseas, especially after World War I. It was a good, legitimate debate. People honestly believed that. And we got some folks today who honestly believe that. But boy, 9/11 put that to rest in my mind. I don't see any way you can look at the threat, if you agree the threat is the potential for another attack and with the next one with deadlier weapons, and say, well, what happens over there is none of our concern. The 9/11 terrorists trained in Afghanistan. That's where the nuclear trade is taking place. You've got North Korea dealing with the Pakistanis dealing with developing the black market, dealing with the Libyans. That stuff it's spreading. It's going to spread, and we have to do everything we can to stop it. And when you've got 19 guys that can come into the United States with airline tickets and box cutters and do what they did to us on 9/11, how can you ignore what's going on over there? You can't. You have to be prepared to work try to have supportive governments, try to have governments that will work with us in denying their territory as a safe haven for those who want to train to kill us. But the United States, the day is long past when we can say, well, that's their problem. We're just going to hunker down here behind our oceans and be safe and secure. That's a pipe dream that was over decades ago in my mind.
Lynn, do you want to say a word about the political situation I just mentioned?
Well, I would point out that what we're seeing happen across the Middle East today is in large part a result of an American foreign policy that's attempting to turn its back on our allies and ensuring that our enemies don't fear us anymore. If you want to understand what happens when America leaves a vacuum in the world, you don't have to look any further than Syria, than the rise of Al-Qaeda across the Middle East again today. It's very clear, the historical record on it is very clear, that a strong America is one of the best guarantors of peace in the world, is the best guarantor of peace in the world. And so when you have a president who has really attempted, I think, to weaken us, who's attempted to bring us down a notch, who doesn't believe that America should lead the world, you see a vacuum created like the one you have in the Middle East today. And vacuums like that, when America turns its back, are filled by those who wish us ill, filled by those who, in the case of Syria, are using chemical weapons against their own people on one side of the fight, and on the other side of the fight, you've got Al-Qaeda on the rise. So the world is more dangerous when America is weak and when America walks away, and I think that's a very clear lesson that you can see today just from turning on the television.
Okay. One more thing, a political question. So many of us have realized, and I think we saw this in the last election more than any other time, that as Republicans, we are just painted as the rich white guys. And unfortunately, I mean, some of the people that we've had in the front make that an easy case to make, but it's not true. And we need to find a way to get around that and present ourselves as more populist, younger, certainly. And what other things would either of you recommend that we can change this persona that most of the electorate seems to have of us?
Since you are a rich white guy, maybe I'll answer this question.
What? Cheap shot.
I think it's an important question, and I think that I don't have anything against rich white guys, obviously. I love a number of them. But I think that as a party, that's how the mainstream media wants to portray us. And what we have to be able to do, obviously, it depends on who is speaking out front for the party, who's leading the party. That's very important. But I don't want to see our party fall into the trap of, frankly, classifying people by the color of their skin, by their income level, by their gender. I think that's what the Democrats do. And I think we have to be the party of ideas. And we got to be the party of ideals. We got to be the party that knows what it stands for. And I also don't want to see us, frankly, trying to be all things to all people. Ronald Reagan made very clear a political party's got to stand for something. We cannot attempt to have a tent that is so big that nobody knows what we believe in. But we have to be able to articulate our beliefs. We got to be able to say to people, look, as Republicans, as conservatives, we believe in the free enterprise system. And we believe in it not only because it makes people wealthy. We believe in it because it has raised more people out of poverty than any other system devised by man in the history of the world. That's why we believe in free enterprise. We are the party of opportunity. We know that the American dream can be real again, but it's not going to be real if every single young person falls under the spell of Barack Obama and the Democrats who are attempting to say, listen, let us help you from cradle to grave. Let us give you assistance all along the way. As a mother of kids, 5 kids, it is amazing to me sometimes to stop and think about the fact that none of them would know what the Soviet Union was if I wasn't telling them and if my husband wasn't telling them. There is a history that seems recent to many of us, but to kids today, they didn't live through the fall of communism. They didn't live through watching nations, frankly, that attempted to control every aspect of their citizens' lives fall apart, crumble. We know what happens. You can see it today across Europe. And those are the policies this president's trying to advocate. And so what we have to do as a party is be able to say, there is an incredible future for all of us. There is an economic renaissance that's possible, for example, if we had the kinds of policies that would allow us to get access to the energy resources we have here in the United States. If we had a president who was really committed to energy independence, for example, we would have economic growth you couldn't even imagine. And across the board, talking to people, explaining to them, young people in particular, you want the government out of your life. You don't want the government more in your life. You know, you want the government, you want to get back to the point where, you know, government is best that governs least and governs closest to the people. That's where we have to be again as a country. And the more that this government tries to give you things, give you benefits, tell you that they can run your life, tell you they can make your life easier, you know, it's a pipe dream, and it's going to end up badly for all of us. The benefit that we have as Republicans and as conservatives is the truth. The truth is on our side, and the facts are on our side. And we have to be unafraid and unabashed about standing up for what we believe in and making the case to the American people. Because if we do it clearly and with conviction and with pride, then we'll win the day.
Thank you very much, and thank you both for being here.
Thank you.